In this lecture, we will cover some of the basic anatomy of the heart. The average adult heart is about 5.5 inches long and 3 inches wide, and as you may recall from some of your earlier biology classes, it approximates the size of a human fist. Males have a generally somewhat larger heart, weighing in at about 11 ounces, whereas females have a slightly smaller heart, somewhere around half a pound or 8 ounces. The heart is located between the right and left lungs, although it is not perfectly in the middle of the right and left lungs. 1/3 of the heart is located on the right side of the chest, while the other 2/3 is located on the left side of the chest. The heart essentially has a main function of propelling blood throughout the body, and it propels the blood to and from most body tissues via two major types of blood vessels, arteries and veins. Arteries are simply defined as the blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart. And recall, or you should note, that this has nothing to do with whether the vessel is carrying oxygenated or deoxygenated blood. So simply arteries carry blood away from the heart. To the contrary of that, veins are the blood vessels that carry blood back to the heart. Again, the definition of veins is not dependent on whether the vessel is carrying oxygenated or deoxygenated blood. Rather, simply defined, veins carry blood back to the heart. So indeed, we will see a case in which there is oxygenated blood being carried through veins because the blood is going back to the heart after being oxygenated in the lungs. The arteries and veins that enter and leave the heart are called the great vessels. You will see these are larger in size than the other vessels or arteries and veins throughout the body. Cardiovascular system generally can also be divided into two different types of circulation. There's pulmonary circulation, and this involves the right side of the heart, the pulmonary arteries and veins, and in essence this is the circulatory system, or the circulatory part of the circulatory system, I should say, that conveys the blood to the lungs and ultimately then back to the left side of the heart so that the oxygenated blood can be carried throughout the body. On the other part of the cardiovascular system consists of systemic circulation, and this involves the left side of the heart ultimately pumping oxygenated blood out to the rest of the body. And as well, systemic circulation involves all the other arteries and veins that convey or carry blood to most of the body tissues, and ultimately then the deoxygenated blood comes back to the right side of the heart. And so here you see a diagram of this cardiovascular system with the heart being the central organ of the system. Again, you see here on the left side of the heart, if we start there, on the left atrium, the left ventricle, and we'll go over these individual compartments of the heart. But you see this oxygenated blood being represented in red, then gets carried throughout the body in this region here from the aorta going up into the brain and the upper extremities of the body, this going down to the lower extremities to the body. And then you see the deoxygenated blood coming back into the right side of the heart, and then which the right ventricle pumps the deoxygenated blood out into the pulmonary circulatory system for pulmonary circulation, in which the blood is then oxygenated in the lungs and returns again within the loop back to the left atrium. And so you see this closed loop system in a human cardiovascular system, but again, two different sort of components of circulation, pulmonary circulation and systemic circulation. And as I mentioned before, the position of the heart, it's not exactly in between the right and left lungs. Rather, the heart is slightly left of the midline. It's deep to the sternum. You should be aware that the heart sits in its own compartment within the thorax, known as the mediastinum. And so that slight chamber is indicated here in this photograph. The pericardium is a tough sac that surrounds the heart, and you see it here outlined in this whitish layer, if you will. And so it sort of surrounds and protects the heart within the mediastinum cavity. And so the pericardium itself is a sac that encloses the heart and protects it. The other thing that the pericardium does is it slightly restricts the heart movement so that it moves only a slight bit within the thorax, again providing a layer of protection for this vital organ. The heart wall itself, and now we're going to speak specifically about the organ, consists of three different or distinct layers. The outermost layer is, or the more superficial layer, is called the epicardium. The middle layer, if you will, is called the myocardium, and this is the thickest of all the three layers, and this is what we generally think of when we refer to as cardiac muscle tissue. The myo meaning muscle, this is where most of the strength of the heart comes from. And then there's a very delicate inner layer or deep layer in terms of anatomical terms. And the endocardium consists of what is the internal surface of the heart chambers and ultimately the external surface of the heart valves. And this you can think of as the inner layer of the heart. And here you see a diagram with these three layers, and this is the epicardium. This is the outer layer. It consists of simple squamous epithelial cells. These are single cell layers. These are the same cells that are found lining the inside of your cheek, for example. This outer epicardium layer also consists of some areolar connective tissue and some fat layers. And then deep to that you see here in this striated cells, these are indeed some cardiac muscle cells. This is the myocardium layer. As you can see in this drawing, it's the thickest of the three layers and provides the heart with the strength that it has to do its continuous beating. And then you see the third layer here, also a very thin layer, consisting of a smaller amount of areolar connective tissue, and then a little bit of endothelium. And so this is the endocardium. And so the three layers to review are the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. Now, if we talk about some more detailed anatomy of the heart organ itself, you probably are already familiar with the heart possessing four unique and distinct chambers. On the right side of the heart, we find the right atrium and the right ventricle. On the left side of the heart, we find the left atrium and the left ventricle. In between these distinct chambers, the heart also possesses four valves. These are important for maintaining the correct direction of blood flow. There's the right atrioventricular valve. That name tells you essentially exactly where this valve is located, right side of the heart in between the atrium and the ventricle, although the more popular name for the right atrioventricular valve is the tricuspid valve. There's also the pulmonary semilunar valve, the left atrioventricular valve, sometimes referred to as the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve, you may also hear, and then the aortic semilunar valve. And we'll go over a little bit more about these valves and these different chambers in more detail. And so here you see in this diagram, we'll start with the right atrium and sort of step our way through. Right atrium located here in this diagram. In essence, the right atrium receives venous blood from the heart in the systemic circulation. And so in this drawing, anything indicated in blue is representing deoxygenated blood being carried through the chamber, whereas anything represented in red is showing oxygenated blood. And you see this right atrium here. Ultimately, three distinct veins drain into this right atrium, one being the coronary sinus. This is a network, if you will, coming right off of the heart. And so the heart itself needs a blood supply in order to maintain its vitality. And so we'll talk about the heart gets its oxygenated blood right off of the aorta, but there is a coronary sinus that drains any deoxygenated blood coming off the heart into the right atrium. As well, the superior and inferior vena cava, these are very large veins, essentially draining all of the deoxygenated blood from the upper region, mostly the brain of the body, and then the inferior vena cava coming from all of the lower extremities. And so separating the right atrium, though, which, as we had already mentioned, receives all of the deoxygenated blood from the heart and the systemic circulation. From the right atrium, this deoxygenated blood then moves through the right atrioventricular valve or the tricuspid valve to then move into the right ventricle. And this is sort of just to reiterate from the right, and we'll continue to follow the pathway of the blood, but from the right atrium, deoxygenated venous blood flows from the right atrium to the right ventricle through this right atrioventricular or tricuspid valve. And the valve then is forced closed when the right ventricle begins to contract. And the whole point of this then, as you can imagine, if I quickly go back to this diagram, is if you see as this ventricle starts to contract or squeeze the blood into the left, out of the right ventricle into the pulmonary semilunar valve, what you have then is you do not want the blood going backwards here into the right atrium. Instead, you want the blood to be forced out into the pulmonary artery. And so what happens then is as this ventricle contracts, this valve will close down to prevent that blood flow from going backwards. And if we move ahead then, back to where we were, from the right atrium now into the right ventricle, as the right ventricle now will contract, as we had mentioned, this right atrioventricular valve will close down to prevent the backflow. This right ventricle, in essence, receives the deoxygenated blood from the right atrium. There is a thick interventricular septum, I should mention, and you'll see this structure mentioned again when we talk about electrical conduction through the heart. But this septum, in essence, divides the right and left ventricles into these two separate chambers. And this is a very sort of thick-walled structure, and electrical conduction, part of that system, actually runs through this interventricular septum. So it really is an important essence or element of the heart. The inner wall, I will mention, of each ventricle is also somewhat unique in that it displays these very large, irregular muscular ridges, and you see that in this diagram below, and these are called trabeculae corneae. In essence, this shows or details some of the strength of the ventricles that are necessary in order for the blood to be pumped to the necessary different regions of the body. Something else interesting inside the right ventricle, you see there are these three cone-shaped muscle projections inside the right ventricle called papillary muscles. You see some of them being diagrammed here. The papillary muscles, in essence, anchor these very sort of thin strands of connective tissue, and these are called chordae tendineae. In essence, what they do is they anchor the valve, and so these muscles are here to anchor these sort of harp strings, if you will, that are then connected into the valve. And so the chordae tendineae attach to the three cusps of the tricuspid valve and ultimately create these flaps that hang down into the ventricle. And so when, again, the right ventricle contracts, these chordae tendineae allow the valve to close, but ultimately prevent it from flapping back up into the right atrium when you get the strong right ventricular contraction. And so, again, a very sort of interesting anatomical feature within the structure of the valves of the right ventricle. Now, beyond the conus arteriosus, which is essentially the top of the right ventricle, there's a pulmonary semilunar valve, which marks the end of the ventricle and the beginning of the pulmonary trunk. And so this conus arteriosus is sort of an interesting anatomical structure because it creates that sort of break point between when you're leaving the heart and entering now into the pulmonary circulation. Okay, now if we're passing from the right ventricle into the pulmonary, or through, I should say, the pulmonary semilunar valves, let's take a minute to discuss these semilunar valves. There are two semilunar valves that we'll cover. One is the pulmonary semilunar valve. The other is an aortic semilunar valve. They're located in the roof or the top of the right and left ventricles respectively. So the pulmonary semilunar valve is located in the top of the right ventricle. The aortic semilunar valve is located in the top of the left ventricle. And they're called semilunar valves because, as you can see in this diagram here, each valve is composed of three sort of half moon-like cusps. And so here would be one half moon, here would be another half moon, and here would be the third half moon. And you see this is in contrast to either the mitral valve or the tricuspid valve. Both semilunar valves, both the pulmonary and aortic, have this same sort of three half moon-like shapes. And here's just another diagram of them where you can see these half moon shapes a little bit better. They have sort of an interesting mechanism how they work, the semilunar valves. When the ventricles contract, the blood pushes the cusps against the arterial trunk, as you see here. And so here would be an image of you if you were looking down the semilunar valve. And so the ventricle would be somewhere down the bottom of this hole, and it would be forcing the blood up towards you. And so when the blood forces upwards or towards you in this particular diagram, you can see it forces these little cusps open, and the blood would come through this region here. But when the ventricles relax some, the blood starts to flow backwards just a little bit towards the ventricles. And you see these pockets here where ultimately the blood is going to begin to pool. And as the blood pools in there, it's going to force these cusps towards the midline and ultimately close off this valve. And so it's a very simple but an elegant and a very efficient system at which it maintains the blood flow in the correct direction through the body. Now, if we move along to the other chamber of the heart, this being the left atrium receives oxygenated blood now from the lungs, and so the travels through the pulmonary veins into this left atrium. The left atrium also is separated from the left ventricle by another left atrioventricular valve, or as we said, a bicuspid or a mitral valve. And this valve has only two triangular cusps, which you may have noticed in the previous diagram, which makes it a little bit different from the right atrioventricular valve, or tricuspid, having three triangular cusps. This valve is forced shut, much like we saw before when we were talking about the right side of the heart. This valve, the bicuspid valve, gets forced closed when the left ventricle contracts. And now the left ventricle is a very interesting organ. It's typically 3 times thicker than the right ventricular wall. So it's a much thicker, as you can see here. Here's the right ventricle, and here's the left ventricle wall as you compare the sort of size of those walls. The left ventricle has a much stronger wall because it has to pump the blood to the entire body except for the lungs. And therefore you can imagine it has to generate much more or much greater blood pressure in order to get the blood to move to the rest of the body. At the superior end, or the roof of this left ventricle, is an aortic semilunar valve. This is the second one of the semilunar valves. And in essence, it marks the end of the left ventricle and the beginning of the aorta. So let's take a minute to quickly review the blood flow through the heart and how it relates to moving through the different valves of the heart as well.
We'll start with the basics and examine how the human heart works. The heart is a muscle about the size of a clenched fist that is located under the rib cage and between the lungs. It is divided into a left side and a right side. Each side has 2 chambers. The upper chambers are called atria, and the lower chambers are called ventricles. Blood flows from the atria to the ventricles through one-way valves. The atria and the ventricles work together as a team to pump blood through the heart. The right atrium receives oxygen-depleted blood from the body and pushes it into the right ventricle, which pumps it out to the lungs. Oxygen-enriched blood is returned from the lungs to the left atrium, which pushes it into the left ventricle, where it is pumped back out to the body. After the body has used all of the oxygen in the blood returns to the heart and the cycle repeats. In a normal heart, this sequence occurs 60 to 100 times per minute.
Okay, now as I had mentioned, not only do we have pulmonary and systemic circulation, But we also need to consider that the heart itself as an organ needs to be able to exchange waste with the blood and to receive nutrients and oxygen, etc. And so the heart has its own, if you will, we could add a third layer to that called coronary circulation. And now the coronary arteries are the only branches given off by the ascending aorta. And so being the vital organ that it is, the heart receives sort of the first taste, if you will, or the first dibs on the blood, oxygen-rich blood coming off of the ventricles into the aorta, or off of, I should say, the left ventricle into the aorta. And so you see these branches here, right off of the aorta. There's a right coronary artery and a left coronary artery. These travel within the coronary sulcus, and they ultimately supply the heart wall and muscle with oxygen and nutrients. As well, after the coronary arteries carry blood to the heart, there is also a system for returning deoxygenated blood back into the right atrium. And so there's three major veins here. There's the great cardiac vein outlined here in red. There's a middle cardiac vein, and then there's also a small cardiac vein. So three major veins are going to return venous blood from the heart wall muscle back into the right atrium. All three veins drain into one final larger vein, as I had mentioned previously. They all dump into the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus then drains into the right atrium. Okay, so we're going to diverge for 1 minute, because the whole point of bringing up a little bit of this cardiac anatomy and including this module in our set for this course is to better understand and make students aware of coronary artery disease. Coronary artery disease, sometimes abbreviated CID, affects almost 13 million Americans, making it the most common form of heart disease. And so while heart disease in general is a fairly common, unfortunately, affliction for Americans, coronary artery disease is the most common. And some of the complications from coronary artery disease include arrhythmia and heart attacks, also called myocardial infarction. And it's the leading cause of death in the United States. So certainly something that we should all be aware of, and certainly something we should all be working hard to prevent. CAD most often results from a condition known as atherosclerosis. You may have heard of this or heard it in the news. Essentially, atherosclerosis is when there's a waxy substance that forms inside the arteries that supply the blood to your heart. And this substance is called a plaque. It's made of mostly cholesterol, fatty compounds, calcium, and fibrin. But as you can imagine, anytime you have some sort of substance now blocking the piping system, you're going to reduce blood flow and ultimately have problems related to that reduced blood flow. What causes atherosclerosis? Well, ultimately, the theory is that the disease starts when there's some sort of damage. Very tiny damage is all it takes to the very inner lining of the artery. And so that's that endothelium layer. And when there's some sort of disruption to that, things don't flow as well as they should through the tubing. And so some things that can lead to the development of this damage and ultimately to the development of plaque include things such as a high blood pressure, high levels of cholesterol, triglycerides in the blood, and smoking. And so any one of these things can ultimately lead to this very small bit of damage and the ultimate development of plaques. And so here on the left, you see a cartoon of the damage and the plaque formation. And here on the right is an actual plaque. And you could see, rather than having a nice, large, round, smooth cavity for which the blood to flow, you see instead this plaque has developed here and is starting to occlude the region in which you can have blood flow. A couple of different terms I just want you to be familiar with, though, how CAD is diagnosed. There's several different ways, and I think depending on your particular physician or how far along they believe the disease could be, each one of these has sort of positives and negatives in terms of diagnosis. A baseline EKG, which is a pretty simple thing to do. It's non-invasive, records your heart's electrical activity while you sit quietly. Then you can also undergo a stress test, which is in essence after you have exercised vigorously. And then they'll do another EKG and sort of compare the two and look to see how is your heart responding to this increase in exercise. And in essence, the tests are designed to show if your heart is not working properly and if your heart is not able to, in essence, provide your body with the oxygen that it needs. Another mechanism is to do an echocardiography. This uses sound waves to produce an image of the heart to see how it is working. In the lab exercise for this particular module, you will go inside a virtual lab, a Howard Hughes Medical Institute designed virtual lab. And in that lab, and as you're doing your patient diagnoses for different cardiac disorders, you will perform an echocardiography and get to see what those images look like. And I'll preface now by saying they can be very difficult to read for an untrained eye. But the exercise is interesting so that you can see what a physician may see in order to make a particular diagnosis. There's also a coronary angiography. Now this becomes a little bit more invasive. This is performed in the cardiac catheterization lab. You're given some sort of medicine to relax you. The dye is injected into your bloodstream. That's sort of the more invasive part there, having to get the needle. The doctors, in essence, then can take an X-ray movie of the heart action and the blood flow through your particular valves. And so you can imagine you're going to get a little bit more detail here than you could in the echocardiography or the EKG. Doctors using the coronary angiography can actually see the number of blockages you have, and they can see how serious those blockages are, and ultimately then determine the best medical treatment. And lastly, this is probably the most expensive of all of the diagnostic tools, and this is positron emission tomography, or PET scans. In essence, this uses information about the energy of certain elements. I won't go into the detail of it, but to show which parts of the heart are alive and working and which, in essence, are not functioning properly. And so a PET scan can also show if your heart's getting enough blood in order to keep that muscle healthy. But again, the downside of a PET scan, it is probably the most expensive of all of the diagnostic tools. So here's just an example of an angiogram in which you can see, as we had mentioned, for the angiogram as a review, they were going to give you some sort of a dye, and then they were going to do an X-ray movie to be able to look at the blood flow in the valves. And this is the kind of image that they can get back and look for blockages within those particular images. So if you've been diagnosed with CID, what can you do to treat it? Well, it's not an untreatable disorder, which is a positive thing. The number one way to go after this is with certain medicines. You've all probably heard of nitroglycerin or nitro. In essence, what this does is it widens or dilates the arteries and improves the blood flow to your heart, which is why anybody who's at a high risk for a stroke or heart attack, they may have been given or may actually have at their disposal nitroglycerin to take. It can be given through a skin patch, pills, an ointment, or a spray. There's many different ways to get it to an individual. And it can be used as a resuscitation or a rescue mechanism, I should say, should someone suffer from a heart attack. Beta blockers can also be used. In essence, these block chemical or hormonal messages sent to your heart. When you're under a lot of physical or emotional stress, your body's going to send signals to your heart to work harder. If you recall the old fight or flight syndromes, beta blockers are going to block these hormonal signals and ultimately sort of trick your body into keeping your heart relaxed. And there's also these calcium channel blockers. Again, these can keep your arteries open and reduce your blood pressure by relaxing the smooth muscle that surrounds the arteries in your body. So any one of these is effective, although certainly not what you would want optimally to have to use consistently to treat your CID. On a more invasive mechanism, if the coronary artery disease cannot be treated with medicine alone and is at this point more severe, then there's angioplasty, which is an option. And in essence, what's happening then is the physician inserts a catheter, which essentially has a small balloon on the tip. The individual would be anesthetized for this particular procedure. And then you see they ultimately inflate the balloon at the blockage site and flatten or squish the plaque so that you can open up the artery again. Now, as you can imagine, while this can provide some relief for a particular period of time, it's not foolproof because you still have this region of damage to the arteries. And so over time, the plaque will simply just redevelop in these locations again. A couple other different types of surgery can also be performed. Laser ablation is another mechanism, and in this case now again you're using a catheter with some sort of a laser on the tip to ultimately burn away the plaque. And so if you've got an issue where the blockage is so severe that doing some sort of angioplasty was not possible, you can also perhaps have laser ablation, which would then open up the artery enough to allow the angioplasty to occur. And in the most sort of extreme cases, although unfortunately with the high percentage of individuals with coronary artery disease, we are seeing this more and more common now, and that's coronary artery bypass surgery. And this is in essence where you simply bypass the vessel, go get a vein from another region of the body. Usually they use the saphenous vein in the thigh, and then ultimately reroute the blood through or reroute, I should say, around the vessel that's causing the blockage. Okay. So we're going to step away now. We've talked about the basic anatomy of the heart. We've talked about what can, in essence, go wrong with respect to coronary artery disease. And before I leave the heart fully, though, I want to take a couple of minutes and talk about the conducting system of the heart, because it really is sort of an interesting conduction system, how the heart makes itself beat, if you will. And it's different than what we see for other parts of the nervous system. So in essence, cardiac muscle fibers contract as a single unit, which is very unique because in essence, they're all connected with low resistance cell-to-cell junctions called gap junctions, which is in essence these small little holes, if you will, that the cells can use to crosstalk with one another. And that's somewhat unique in itself. And therefore, an electrical impulse, when it's conducted, is distributed immediately and spontaneously throughout all cells of the atria and then ultimately down into the ventricles. And so it's this unique feature, these gap junctions located within these intercalated discs, that allow the cells to crosstalk with each other very, very efficiently. Okay. And so the heart, as you know, has a continuous beat to it, and it exhibits autorhythmicity, which means it's capable of initiating its own heartbeat independent of the external nerves. And this is what makes the heart a bit unique. And this electrical impulse originates here in these special cardiac muscle cells. We won't get into the details of how those particular cells function because that gets to be pretty detailed and specific, but it is very, very interesting mechanism. If you're interested in mechanisms of how cells work, we can discuss it on on a discussion board or whatnot. But in essence, this electrical impulse starts within the sinoatrial node. You may have heard it called also the pacemaker, which is really just a group of specialized cells that work together to initiate this heartbeat or electrical impulse. Now, the SA node is located on the posterior wall of the right atrium, adjacent to the opening of the superior vena cava. So it's up near the right atrium where the electrical conduction system starts. The SA node generates 70 to 80 impulses per minute under the parasympathetic nervous system control. So this would be your resting heart rate in essence. With no outside nervous system influence, the heart can generate a 70 to 80 impulse per minute beat. Okay, now, as we said, the electrical impulse starts within the sinoatrial node or the pacemaker, and then this electrical impulse travels to the left atrium, And it also then travels to this atrioventricular node, which is located in the floor of the right atrium. So really, if you review and think about this, the entire electrical conduction system of the heart starts out in two major structures of the right atrium. The first being the SA node, and the second being the AV node. The SA node is the one that initially fires off the electrical impulse. It then travels to the left atrium and simultaneously down to the AV node. The electrical activity then leaves the AV node and travels through this atrioventricular bundle, or called the bundle of His. And remember, this is the interventricular septum, so keeping some of the terms straight can help you remember the particular structures. So as it travels through the atrioventricular bundle, or the bundle of His, it then ultimately divides into the right and the left bundles. Then these bundles, the right and the left, pass this electrical conduction off into a series of fibers called Purkinje fibers. And you start to see these here, located at the apex of the heart, which is this sort of pointed cone region of the heart down here. And now these Purkinje fibers spread the impulse upwards or superiorly from the apex to all of the ventricular myocardium. So it's kind of interesting. You see this electrical conduction immediately irradiates from the bottom up towards the top. And again, if you recall, the cells are interconnected with one another. And so it's almost an instantaneous contraction, I should say, of the entire region of the ventricle. Now let's take a second to review how this conduction system of the heart works with a small film.
Action potentials originate in the sinoatrial node and travel across the wall of the atrium from the sinoatrial node to the atrioventricular node. Action potentials pass slowly through the atrioventricular node to give the atria time to contract. They then pass rapidly along the atrioventricular bundle, which extends from the atrioventricular node through the fibrous skeleton into the interventricular septum. The atrioventricular bundle divides into right and left bundle branches, and action potentials descend rapidly to the apex of each ventricle along the bundle branches. Action potentials are carried by the Purkinje fibers from the bundle branches to the ventricular walls. The rapid conduction from the atrioventricular bundle to the ends of the Purkinje fibers allows the ventricular muscle cells to contract in unison, providing a strong contraction.
To keep things straight, I put together this slide, which sort of gives a sequence of this coordinated sequence of the heart chamber contractions. First, the SA node generates the impulse. Both of the atria contract almost simultaneously, which is called systole, while the ventricles are relaxed. This is diastole. The impulse then goes from the SA node to the AV node and then to the ventricles. And at this point, the ventricles contract for systole while the atria relax, which is diastole.